The icy waters of the Delaware River crashed against the wooden hull of the Durham boat as General George Washington gripped the gunwale with frost-bitten fingers. It was December 25, 1776, and the Continental Army was dying not from British bullets, but from despair itself. Behind him, 2,400 ragged soldiers huddled in the bitter cold, their breath forming ghostly clouds in the winter air. Many had no shoes, leaving bloody footprints in the snow that would become legend. The American Revolution hung by a thread thinner than spider silk. Just months earlier, the colonists had declared independence with bold proclamations and soaring rhetoric. Now, as 1776 drew to its close, that dream seemed as frozen as the river they were crossing. The British had driven Washington's army from New York in a series of humiliating defeats. Long Island, White Plains, Fort Washington, each battle had stripped away more men, more hope, more belief that 13 scattered colonies could stand. Against the mightiest empire on earth, in the flickering candlelight of his field tent, Washington had studied the intelligence reports with growing alarm. His army was melting away like snow in spring. Enlistments would expire on December 31st, and thousands of soldiers planned to simply walk home. The Continental Congress had fled Philadelphia, scattering like leaves before a storm. Even his most trusted advisors whispered of surrender, of negotiating terms with the Crown before complete annihilation became inevitable, but Washington possessed something that no military manual could teach: an understanding that wars were won not just with muskets and cannons, but with the human spirit. He knew that one victory, one moment of triumph, could resurrect hope from the grave of despair. The question was whether such a moment could be seized before the cause died entirely. Across the river, the Hessian garrison at Trenton celebrated Christmas with German thoroughness. Colonel Johann Raul, a veteran of European campaigns, had dismissed warnings about American movements with the contempt of a professional soldier for amateur rebels. His men had been drinking heavily, confident that no army would march through such weather. The very idea seemed absurd. What civilized force would attack on Christmas night through a blizzard? As Washington's boats fought the ice-choked current, each man understood they were crossing more than a river. They were crossing from certain defeat into the realm of possibility. The general had told them plainly, this was their moment to prove that Americans could fight, that liberty was worth dying for, that a ragtag army of farmers and merchants could stand against the world's greatest military machine. The wind howled through the bare branches of the Pennsylvania woods, carrying with it the scent of change. Behind them lay the safety of retreat, of giving up, of accepting British rule. Ahead lay Trenton, and beyond that, an uncharted path that would lead through Princeton to Valley Forge, and ultimately to Yorktown. But none of them knew that yet. They knew only that their general had asked them to trust him one more time, to believe that morning would bring victory instead of annihilation. As the first boats reached the New Jersey shore, Washington stepped onto the frozen ground and felt the weight of a nation's future settling on his shoulders. The Battle of Princeton was still days away, but its foundations were being laid in this moment of desperate courage. When an army chose to advance rather than surrender, to fight rather than flee, the surprise attack on Trenton at dawn on December 26 succeeded beyond Washington's wildest hopes. The Hessians, caught completely off guard, surrendered after a brief but fierce fight. Colonel Raul lay mortally wounded, his professional dismissal of the Americans proving fatal. But as Washington surveyed the captured supplies and prisoners, he knew that one victory would not be enough. The British would respond with overwhelming force, and his army would be crushed if they simply waited for the counterattack. The capture of Trenton electrified the colonies like lightning striking a powder keg. According to contemporary accounts from the Pennsylvania Journal, news of the victory spread faster than wildfire, reaching Philadelphia by December 27th and sparking celebrations throughout the 13 colonies. Suddenly, the impossible seemed possible. The amateur rebels had defeated professional European soldiers. The Continental Army had not only survived but triumphed. Yet Washington understood that momentum was everything in warfare. One victory could spark a revolution, but it could also invite annihilation, if not followed by continued success. The British were already mobilizing their response. General Lord Cornwallis, the aristocratic commander who had been preparing to return to England for the winter social season, canceled his departure and began gathering every available soldier for a counterattack. The mathematical reality was stark. Washington had approximately 5,000 men, many of them militia with expiring enlistments. Cornwallis was assembling 8,000 veteran troops, supported by artillery and cavalry. In a direct confrontation, the Americans would be obliterated. The general needed to find a way to strike again before the British could organize their response. But every conventional military principle argued against further offensive action. As the last days of 1776 slipped away, Washington made a decision that would define his generalship and change the course of history. He would not retreat across the Delaware to safety. Instead, he would recross the river with his entire army and take position at Trenton, daring the British to come to him. It was a gamble that violated every rule of military prudence, but Washington had learned that prudence was a luxury his cause could not afford. The recrossing began on December 30th. A logistical nightmare that tested every resource of the Continental Army. The same Durham boats that had carried them to victory now ferried them back into mortal danger. Supplies, artillery, prisoners, and nearly 5,000 men had to be moved across the ice-clogged river while British scouts watched from the hills. Every hour increased the risk of discovery, of being caught divided with half the army on each side of the Delaware. On New Year's Eve, as church bells rang across Europe to celebrate the arrival of 1777, Washington addressed his troops in the frigid streets of Trenton. He spoke of duty, of the cause of liberty, of the generations yet unborn who would judge their actions in this moment. More importantly, he offered a bounty of $10 to any soldier who would extend his enlistment for 6 weeks. It was money the Continental Congress did not have, but Washington promised it anyway. Understanding that some promises were worth making even when fulfillment seemed impossible, the response was not universal. Many soldiers still departed when their terms expired on December 31st, but enough remained to give Washington hope. These men, ragged and hungry, but still willing to fight, would form the core of the force that would soon march toward Princeton. Had chosen to trust their general's vision of victory over the comfortable certainty of going home as 1777 dawned cold and clear. Washington established his headquarters in Trenton and began planning his next move. Cornwallis was coming with overwhelming force. But the American general had learned something crucial in the past week. Audacity could triumph over arithmetic, surprise over strength, and the spirit of free men over the machinery of empire. Lord Cornwallis arrived at Princeton on January 2nd, 1777. With the confidence of a man who had cornered his prey. The Earl was a seasoned campaigner who had served in the 7 Years' War and possessed the aristocratic bearing that made him a natural leader of men. He had rushed north from New York with 8,000 troops, leaving behind the comfort of winter quarters to personally oversee the destruction of Washington's upstart army. The British plan was elegantly simple. Cornwallis would advance from Princeton to Trenton with overwhelming force, pin Washington against the Delaware River, and crush the Continental Army in a decisive battle. With the rebel leadership captured or killed, the revolution would collapse, and the 13 colonies would return to the Crown's embrace. It was a strategy that had worked against countless enemies across the British Empire. As dawn broke on January 2nd, Cornwallis's advance guard encountered American resistance at the bridge over a sun-pink creek, just south of Trenton. Was fierce but brief Captain Alexander Hamilton's battery of artillery, manned by New York volunteers, held the bridge until the main American force could withdraw into Trenton proper. The young captain, barely 20 years old, would later recall this as one of the most terrifying moments of his life. Watching British regulars advance through the smoke while his cannons roared defiance. Throughout the day, Cornwallis pressed his attack, but the Americans fought with desperate skill. Every street became a battlefield, every house a fortress. The British advanced methodically, their disciplined formations pushing the rebels back step by step, but the resistance was fiercer than expected. These were not the same demoralized soldiers who had fled across New Jersey just weeks earlier. had changed in the American army. By evening, the British had driven Washington's forces to the banks of the Delaware, apparently achieving their objective. Cornwallis surveyed the American position with satisfaction. The rebels were trapped with their backs to the river, their escape route blocked by ice and current. He would finish what Generals Howe and Clinton had started: the complete destruction of the Continental Army. "We've got the old fox safe now," Cornwallis reportedly told his staff officers as they established their headquarters in Princeton. "We'll go over and bag him in the morning." The Earl was so confident of victory that he declined his subordinates' suggestions for a night attack, preferring to allow his men to rest before the final assault. It was a decision that would haunt British strategy for the remainder of the war. But Washington was not the old fox his enemies believed him to be. He was something far more dangerous. Throughout the night of January 2nd, as British sentries watched the American campfires burning along the Delaware, the Continental Army was executing one of the most audacious maneuvers in military history. Using muffled wheels and cloth-wrapped hooves, the entire American force was slipping away in the darkness, marching not towards safety across the river, but north toward Princeton. The campfires that burned all night were a deception. Small groups of men had been left behind to feed the flames and make noise, creating the illusion of a full army in position. Meanwhile, the main force followed a circuitous route along back roads that local guides knew intimately. It was a march that required absolute silence and perfect timing. With 5,000 men moving through the frozen countryside, while their enemies slept just miles away, as the first hint of dawn touched the eastern horizon on January 3rd, Washington's army was approaching Princeton from the rear, having covered 18 miles in the bitter cold. The British garrison, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mohood, had no idea that death was marching toward them through the winter morning. The trap that Cornwallis had set for Washington was about to spring in reverse, and the course of the revolution would be determined by the events of the next few hours. The gamble was extraordinary in its scope and terrifying in its implications. If discovered, the American army would be caught in the open, surrounded by superior forces, and annihilated. But if successful, the victory would prove that the Continental Army was not just a collection of amateur rebels. It was a force capable of outmaneuvering the finest military minds in Europe. The frozen ground crunched beneath the boots of the Continental Army as they approached Princeton in the pre-dawn darkness of January 3rd, 1777. General Washington rode at the head of his columns, his breath forming clouds in the bitter air as he surveyed the sleeping town ahead. Behind him, 5,000 men moved with the quiet determination of soldiers who understood they were about to attempt the impossible. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mohood commanded the British garrison at Princeton, a force of approximately 1,200 men from the 17th, 40th, and 55th Regiments of Foot. These were veteran soldiers who had served the crown across the globe, men who had faced French regulars in Europe and understood the precise mathematics of 18th-century warfare. They had no reason to expect that a ragtag American army would appear at their doorstep at sunrise. The town of Princeton itself was a small but prosperous community, home to the College of New Jersey, which would later become Princeton University. The college building, Nassau Hall, served as a barracks for British troops, its Georgian architecture providing solid shelter against the January cold. The irony was not lost on the approaching Americans. They were about to fight for independence in the shadow of an institution dedicated to learning and enlightenment. As the eastern sky began to lighten, Washington divided his force into two columns. General John Sullivan would lead the main attack along the Post Road, the primary route into Princeton. Meanwhile, General Nathanael Greene would circle around to cut off any British retreat toward New Brunswick. It was a classic pincer movement, designed to trap the enemy garrison and prevent their escape. The first shots of the Battle of Princeton rang out at approximately 8 o'clock in the morning, when American advance scouts encountered a British patrol near the Quaker Meeting House. The patrol, led by Captain John McPherson of the 17th Foot, immediately recognized the danger and began a fighting withdrawal toward the main British position. The element of surprise was lost. But the Americans pressed forward with grim determination. Lieutenant Colonel Mohud reacted with the professionalism expected of a British officer. Within minutes of the first alarm, he had his men formed in battle lines and was marching out to meet the American attack. The British moved with a mechanical precision that had made them feared across Europe. Their red coats bright against the snow as they advanced in perfect formation. The initial clash occurred in an orchard belonging to William Clark, about half a mile from Princeton. The fighting was immediate and brutal, with both sides pouring devastating volleys into each other at close range. The Americans, despite their recent victories, were still learning the terrible art of facing professional soldiers in open battle. Many had never experienced the psychological shock of standing firm while disciplined. Enemies advanced with fixed bayonets. Captain Alexander Hamilton, commanding his artillery battery, unlimbered his guns and began firing grapeshot into the British ranks. The young officer, who had distinguished himself at Trenton, watched with professional admiration as the British maintained their formation despite the carnage. These were not the surprised Hessians of a week earlier. These were veteran soldiers who knew their business. The tide of battle seemed to turn against the Americans as the British pressed their attack. The 17th Foot in particular fought with exceptional courage, their disciplined volleys forcing the Continental troops to give ground. For a terrifying moment, it appeared that the entire American assault might collapse, just as it had in so many previous battles. But then Washington himself appeared at the critical moment, riding between the lines with a calmness that bordered on supernatural. Eyewitnesses would later describe how the general seemed immune to the bullets whistling around him, his presence transforming frightened soldiers into heroes. He rallied the wavering American line and led a counterattack that broke the British resistance. The psychological impact of Washington's personal leadership cannot be overstated. His soldiers, many of whom had seen him only from a distance during their retreat across New Jersey, now watched their commander risk his life alongside them. This was not a general who commanded from the safety of headquarters. This was a leader who shared their dangers and their destiny. As the British line began to crumble, the full weight of the American attack became apparent. This was not the desperate last stand of a dying army, but the calculated assault of a force that had learned to fight and win. The crash of musket fire echoed across the frozen fields as the Battle of Princeton reached its crucial moment. Lieutenant Colonel Mohud's British regulars, despite their professionalism, found themselves caught in an impossible situation. What had begun as a routine morning in winter quarters had exploded into a desperate fight for survival against an enemy that was supposed to be trapped 18 miles away at Trenton. The fighting in Clark's Orchard had devolved into a series of individual actions, small groups of men struggling for advantage among the bare apple trees. The British 17th Foot, despite suffering heavy casualties, maintained their disciplined formation and continued to deliver devastating volleys. Their muskets, fired in coordinated sequence, created a wall of lead that forced the Americans to seek whatever cover they could find. Captain Hamilton's artillery continued to rake the British lines, but the young officer found himself engaged in a deadly duel with British field pieces that had been hastily brought forward. The mathematics of artillery warfare were brutally simple. Whichever side could silence the enemy's guns would control the battlefield. Hamilton's crews worked with desperate efficiency, loading and firing as fast as humanly possible while British cannonballs screamed overhead. The critical moment came when Washington ordered a general advance across the entire American line. The Continental soldiers, inspired by their general's presence and emboldened by their recent victory at Trenton, surged forward with a ferocity that surprised even their enemies. These were no longer the demoralized troops who had fled across New Jersey in December. They were soldiers who had tasted victory and found it intoxicating. The British resistance, though fierce, began to crack under the relentless pressure. Lieutenant Colonel Mohud, recognizing that his position was becoming untenable, ordered a fighting withdrawal toward Princeton. But the American pincer movement was beginning to take effect. General Greene's column was cutting off the British escape route, while Sullivan's men pressed the attack from the front. In the town of Princeton itself, the remaining British garrison was thrown into chaos. The sound of battle approaching from the southwest meant that Mawhood's force was in retreat, but the scope of the disaster was not yet clear. Officers shouted orders while soldiers ran to their positions, but the confusion was total. No one had anticipated that the Americans would appear in their rear while Cornwallis was supposedly crushing them at Trenton. The retreat became a rout as American soldiers poured into Princeton's streets. The British troops, veteran professionals, who had maintained their discipline under fire, finally broke under the psychological pressure of being surrounded and outnumbered. Small groups of redcoats fought desperate rearguard actions at street corners, while their comrades fled toward New Brunswick. Nassau Hall, the college building that served as a British barracks, became the focal point of the final fighting.
Captain
Hamilton, his artillery having been brought forward through the streets, trained his guns on the building and demanded its surrender. The sight of American cannons pointed at the seat of learning created a moment of symbolic power that resonated far beyond the immediate tactical situation. According to detailed accounts preserved in the American Historical Review, the British garrison in Nassau Hall surrendered after a brief cannonade that shattered several windows but caused minimal casualties. The symbolism was profound. American soldiers had captured a British stronghold in the very building where future leaders of the new nation would be educated. The College of New Jersey would indeed play a crucial role in training the men who would govern the United States, but the true significance of the Battle of Princeton extended far beyond the capture of a single building or the defeat of a single garrison. For the first time in the war, American forces had not merely survived contact with professional European troops, they had outmaneuvered them, outfought them, and decisively defeated them in open battle. The psychological impact on both sides was immense. Washington, surveying the battlefield as the last pockets of resistance were eliminated, understood that something fundamental had changed. His army had proven to itself and to the world that Americans could fight. The Continental soldiers who had crossed the Delaware on Christmas night as desperate refugees were now veteran troops who had won 2 significant victories in 8 days. The transformation was as complete as it was remarkable. The British casualties were severe, nearly 200 killed, wounded, or captured out of a garrison of 1,200. But the American losses were relatively light, fewer than 50 men killed or wounded. The disparity in casualties reflected not just tactical superiority, but a fundamental shift in the nature of the conflict. The news of Princeton's fall reached Lord Cornwallis at Trenton like a thunderbolt from a clear sky. The Earl, who had been preparing for a leisurely morning assault on the trapped American army, discovered that his prey had not only escaped, but had destroyed one of his major garrisons. The professional soldier in him recognized the implications. Immediately, he had been completely outmaneuvered by an opponent he had dismissed as an amateur. The British response was swift and furious. Cornwallis abandoned his pursuit of Washington's phantom army at Trenton and began a forced march toward Princeton, hoping to catch the Americans before they could consolidate their victory. But Washington, ever mindful of the mathematical realities of 18th century warfare, had no intention of facing 8,000 British regulars with his smaller force. The Continental Army began withdrawing toward Morristown, even as the smoke of battle still rose from Princeton streets. The strategic implications of the twin victories at Trenton and Princeton reverberated throughout the Atlantic world. In London, the news arrived like a series of hammer blows to the British government's confidence. King George III, who had been assured by his ministers that the American rebellion was nearly crushed, found himself confronting the reality that the war was far from over. The professional assessment of British generals, who had predicted easy victory, was suddenly called into question. The psychological impact on the American colonies was even more profound. For months, the cause of independence had seemed hopeless. The Continental Army had been driven from battlefield after battlefield. Congress had fled Philadelphia, and many colonists had begun to reconcile themselves to British rule. The victories in New Jersey changed everything suddenly. Independence seemed not just possible, but inevitable. Recruitment for the Continental Army, which had been virtually impossible during the dark days of December, began to accelerate dramatically. Young men who had been reluctant to join what appeared to be a losing cause now flocked to Washington's banner. Continental Congress, emboldened by military success, began to function effectively again. International observers, particularly in France, began to take the American cause seriously for the first time. The French reaction was particularly significant for a long-term course of the war. French Foreign Minister Comte Vergennes, who had been secretly providing limited aid to the Americans, began to consider the possibility of open alliance. The victories at Trenton and Princeton demonstrated that American forces could defeat European professionals, a crucial prerequisite for French involvement. Without French support, American independence would have been impossible, and French support would not have materialized without proof that the Americans could win. The British military establishment was forced to confront uncomfortable truths about their previous assumptions. The idea that American forces were inherently inferior to European professionals was shattered by the events in New Jersey. More importantly, the British began to understand that they were not facing a simple rebellion, but a genuine war of independence. With all the implications that carried for military strategy and political settlement, General Howe, the British commander-in-chief, was forced to abandon his plans for a quick end to the war. The comfortable winter quarters in New York would have to be defended, and British forces would have to be dispersed across New Jersey to prevent further American attacks. The initiative, which had belonged to the British since the beginning of the war, was now firmly in American hands. The transformation of the Continental Army was perhaps the most significant long-term consequence of the Battle of Princeton. The soldiers who had fought through the winter of 1776 to 1777 had proven to themselves that they could stand against the best troops in the world. This psychological transformation would sustain them through the terrible trials ahead. Valley Forge, Monmouth, and the long campaigns in the South. Washington himself had been transformed by the experience. The defeats in New York had taught him the limitations of his forces, but the victories in New Jersey had shown him their potential. He now understood that the war would be won not through single decisive battles, but through a campaign of attrition that would exhaust British resources and resolve the Continental Army withdrew to winter quarters in Morristown, New Jersey, but they were no longer the same force that had crossed the Delaware on Christmas night. They were veterans now, soldiers who had learned the hardest lesson of all that they could win: the morning sun that rose over Morristown on January 10th. 1777 illuminated an army transformed. The Continental soldiers who had marched through the frozen New Jersey countryside were no longer the desperate men who had fled across the Delaware just weeks earlier. They were veterans now, hardened by victory and steeled by the knowledge that they had faced the best soldiers in the world and emerged triumphant. Washington established his headquarters in the Arnold Tavern, a modest building that would serve as the nerve center of American resistance for the remainder of the winter. From this unpretentious command post, he would plan the campaigns that would ultimately lead to Yorktown and independence. But in January of 1777, such victory seemed distant indeed. The immediate task was to sustain the army through the brutal winter and build upon the momentum created by the HML. Victories at Trenton and Princeton. The impact of Princeton extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. In Philadelphia, the Continental Congress reconvened with renewed confidence. No longer the panicked body that had fled the capital just weeks earlier, the delegates began to take seriously the task of creating a new nation. Understanding that military success had given them the breathing space necessary for political construction. The Articles of Confederation, which would govern the United States until the Constitution, began to take shape in the aftermath of Princeton. The British, meanwhile, were forced to confront the reality that their previous strategy had failed completely. General Howe's plan for a quick victory through overwhelming force had been shattered by an enemy who refused to accept defeat. The comfortable assumption that American forces were inherently inferior to European professionals had been exploded by the events in New Jersey. New strategies would be required, for it was clearly going to be a long and difficult war. The international implications of Princeton were even more significant. In Paris, the French court watched with growing interest as the American colonists demonstrated their ability to defeat European armies. The Comte de Vergennes, Louis XVI's foreign minister, began serious consideration of an alliance that would bring France into the war against Britain. Such an alliance would transform the American Revolution from a colonial rebellion into a global conflict. Benjamin Franklin, serving as American ambassador to France, found his task immeasurably easier after Princeton. French skepticism about American military capabilities had been a major obstacle to formal alliance. Now, with proof that Continental forces could defeat British regulars, Franklin could negotiate from a position of strength. The Treaty of Alliance, signed in February of 1778, would bring French naval power and military support to the American cause. The psychological transformation of the American people was perhaps the most profound consequence of Princeton. The victories in New Jersey had proven that independence was not just a dream but an achievable goal. Young men who had been reluctant to enlist in what appeared to be a hopeless cause now joined the Continental Army in increasing numbers. Militia system, which had been demoralized by repeated defeats, began to function effectively again. But the true measure of Princeton's significance lay in what it revealed about the nature of the conflict. This was not simply a rebellion against British rule, but the birth of a new kind of nation, founded on principles that would reshape the world. The soldiers who had fought at Princeton were not just defending their homes, they were creating the foundation for a democratic republic that would serve as a model for oppressed peoples everywhere. The Battle of Princeton demonstrated that a citizen army properly led and inspired by a just cause could defeat professional soldiers fighting for pay and empire. This lesson would resonate throughout the ages, inspiring revolutionary movements from Latin America to Eastern Europe. The American Revolution was not just about independence. It was about the possibility that ordinary people could govern themselves. As winter deepened around Morristown, Washington's army settled into the routine of survival. The victories at Trenton and Princeton had saved the cause of independence, but the war was far from over. Years of fighting lay ahead, with defeats as well as victories, but the foundation had been laid. The Continental Army had proven that Americans could fight, and in doing so, they had created the psychological basis for a new nation. The Battle of Princeton was indeed a crucial turning point in the Revolutionary War. Not because it ended the conflict, but because it transformed it from a hopeless rebellion into a war of independence that could be won. The soldiers who had crossed the Delaware on Christmas night had returned as the founders of a nation, their courage and sacrifice, creating the possibility of American independence. The revolution that began in the hearts of men was now written in the reality of military victory, and nothing would ever be the same in the end. Princeton's significance lay not in the tactical details of the battle, but in its demonstration that the American cause was viable, the impossible had become possible, and with that transformation, the United States of America was truly born.